We are live.
Hello everyone, good morning. On behalf of Exhibitions and India Warehousing Show, I would like to welcome you to the 6th edition of Warehousing Live. Thank you for taking out time and being here today. Today's topic of webinar is Changing Face of Industry, Leveraging the Supply Chain to Boost Your Company's Bottom Line. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Recorded version of this webinar will be available on demand, so don't worry if you miss out anything. The attendees can post their questions in the Q&A box, and we will be running those questions after the panel discussion. Now, I really feel honored to introduce the moderator of our session, Mr. Vivek Dahiya. He's a managing director for logistics and industrial with Cushman and Wakefield, India, and he's a leading authority on India real estate. Vivek's opinion has been widely covered and acknowledged across news dailies and social media. So without a further talk here, I return the time over to our moderator. Mr. Dahiya, over to you.
Thank you, Rima. Thank you, Reed, for this opportunity. And thank you all the panelists for attending, for confirming your attendance for this. I also welcome all the attendees. I can see the count of the participants is increasing really quickly. And let me just, before I introduce the panelists to everyone, just to explain how we will go about today's discussion. We will break our discussion into three parts. Starting off with the opening remarks from our panelists, then we will go into very specific questions to their domain, their industries, their businesses. And then, of course, we'll do some crystal ball gazing in terms of where do we see 21 shaping up. When the November is ending, everybody's getting more and more hopeful. So what's the experts saying about their businesses, their industries for 2021? So let me start off by introducing our esteemed panel. We have six stalwarts from the industry today. We first have Dr. Anil Chinnabhandar, who's the Senior Vice President Landmark. He's an engineering and supply chain professional. He's specialized in supply chain in the retail manufacturing side and has worked with several organizations like Pantaloon, Woolworth, DHL, Harper, LG, Samsung in his career. We also have Mr. Pavel Mehta, who's the head of customer supply chain operations for Nestle in India, where he looks after India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, pretty much the South Asia region. He's worked with Nestle for a number of years, including at the headquarters in Switzerland. We have with us Mr. Ajith Gopinath, the Global Procurement Head, Industrial Supplies and Maintenance Services for Mondelez International. At Mondelez is responsible for driving the development execution of the global spend on both industrial supplies and maintenance. He's servicing about 140 plants in 45 countries, and he's leading a team of multinational colleagues. We also have with us today Mr. Harshal Bhoi, Chief Business Officer of Xpressbees. In his 18 years of experience in the logistics domicile, he's worked extensively in the e-commerce space in the process mapping, process revamping, network design, and optimizing the entire management operations ground up. We have also with us Mr. Vikram Mansukhani, who is the COO of TVS Supply Chain. He brings on board over 21 years of association with just the supply chain industry, looking at the network planning, air operations, and ground operations besides infrastructure and industrial engineering. And finally, last but not the least, Mr. Vickram Srivastava, who's the head of supply chain planning at IPCA Laboratories. He brings in the pharma brain on the panel with the experience of supply chain and project management. He looks after both the demand supply planning, strategic sourcing, vendor development, and I think one person that everyone loves to have on the panel nowadays is from the pharma side, because we expect that industry to be the lifesaver in 2021. Now, without spending too much of time on further conversations, let me just jump quickly on one more aspect of our conversation. We will try to make this entire discussion very, very interactive. We would want the attendees, the people who are participating in this, to become a part of the entire conversation. It's not about 6-7 people talking. So if I could request, we will then do 4 audience polls in this entire discussion. I would request Reed team to put up the first question for the audience poll before we start off with the opening remarks. And then I would request all the participants to take a look at it, give your opinion on the question asked, and the result of that we'll also share fairly quickly during the course of our conversation. So if the Reed team can put up the first question for the opinion poll. Yeah, so here is the question. By how much percentage has your supply chain cost gone up? You can see multiple questions, but my request is to just answer the first question, please. Has your supply chain cost gone up by just less than 5%, or has it gone up by 5 to 10%, or the cost increase has been more than 10%? So if you could just submit your question number 1 response, we can then pick up question number 2 during the conversation at the next stage. And I think this is mainly for the attendees, but I guess even the panelists can probably submit, which is unlikely. But yeah, I can see, interestingly, the count of participants keep increasing, which I believe the next questions will have higher responses. So before we come to the response, let's start off with the opening remarks of the panelists today. And essentially, I would request if the panelists could give their opinion on one particular topic, and the topic would be specifically, anecdotal examples, their experiences of the last 12 months. If you could share one biggest, most important change that they have noticed in their industry or their business or their company's supply chain because of COVID-19. And I would probably just go to the panelists based on what I see on my screen. So if I could request Mr. Pavel Mehta to start, and then we'll go to the other panelists. What's that one change that you noticed which was path-breaking for your industry?
All right, thanks a lot. So let me start off by, first of all, acknowledging the great work that has happened overall in the supply chain industry over the last few months. And secondly, if we talk about the impact of the pandemic, I would like to sort of break it down into 2 very concrete broad areas. I think the first one was what we experienced in the initial phase of the lockdown. There was, a very quick consumer reaction in terms of, at least in the food industry, in terms of stocking up. There was a big shift from certain size of SKUs to larger SKUs. There was a huge challenge in logistics, restricted movements. Labor availability was a big challenge. And of course, the whole aspect of inventory management and managing the price of key input materials was a big challenge in the first phase of the pandemic. That was, I would say, March, end March, April, May. Most of the companies, I think, have managed to find solutions to those problems. I feel in general, if I look at the FMCG industry, if I talk about Nestle and some of our competitors, I find that we have reached a point where we are able to deal with these, I would say, day-to-day disruptions quite effectively now. We have learned how to live with them. But to your point, if I have to single out one aspect of the way supply chain has changed with the pandemic, I would put it very simply like this. I think for many, many years, if you look especially in my industry, supply chain was looked as a cost center. The main primary objective of supply chain was please bring year-on-year savings. If you ask any CEO over the last few years, what do you want from the supply chain head? They would say, well, I want 5%, 7% year-on-year savings, because the basic purpose of supply chain, which was to deliver stock at the right time, in the right quality, was taken for granted. This was sort of, I would say, assume that the supply chain is going to deliver it. So therefore, the main objective of why I need a very experienced, solid supply chain head in my organization is to deliver savings. I think we have flipped that around a bit. And I think the purpose of the organization and the purpose of the discussion today even is very relevant. But in my view, we have flipped that around a bit, because now I think, especially with what is happening in the last few months and what will happen, I think it will continue to happen in the next few years, is that there will be an increased focus in what I would like to call a safe supply chain. And safe in 2 broad areas. First of all, of course, safe from COVID. So you need to have a lot of effort going into making sure that the people are understanding the impact of the COVID, you're protecting them, the basic training to the people down the line is given. So that's one aspect of the safety that I would like to talk about. The other safe is that we have to ensure that despite the disruptions, the supply chain keeps moving on. So a much bigger focus on scenario planning, a much bigger focus on business continuity planning, a much bigger focus on even in the way we look at investments differently. So, traditionally you would look at investments and say, okay, what is the low cost investment model that I can have, whether it is in the contracting of my raw and packing material or even in warehousing. I would say, okay, what do I need for next 3, 4, 5 years? And that has to change. So what is evolving is, and this is what we are doing even in Nestle. So very recently we invested into an expansion of our warehousing operations in the South. And we invested something which is just right for the current scenario with a very clear option of having it scalable. So this is, I think, a big change which is happening in the supply chain area because of the pandemic, is moving away and coming to a point where supply chain is front and center of being really a competitive advantage for many, many companies by, first of all, bringing safety in the whole value chain. And secondly, ensuring through our efforts, through our innovations, that we make sure that despite the disruptions, and they're not going to reduce over the next few years, despite the reductions, we ensure availability of the right stock at the right time with the right quality. So that's, in my view, a big mindset change in the way supply chain is being viewed. If I have to single out one, then of course there are many operational aspects, networking is becoming an issue, et cetera, et cetera.
I think that mindset change is very important because nobody really bothered about how the stuff is reaching everyone's house or the shop or the malls or any other sale point areas. And now during the lockdown and subsequently, everybody was very curious. And I think hats off to the entire supply chain industry in India, where almost hardly any hiccups which was seen, which were which were terrible or which were noteworthy. Yes, there were hiccups. Everybody appreciated it. I think everybody came out smelling of roses out of that initiative. So yeah, that's a fairly good take on this. Let me move to Vickram Srivastava now. On the pharma side, and again we'll come to the future because that's the critical for you. But what was that one change that you saw in your industry because of COVID, and what did you learn from that?
Sure. So, very good morning to all my co-panelists and to all the listeners. Thank you, Vivek, for having me here. So before I get to your specific question, I just want to build a background to, what has really happened. It's been unprecedented. I mean, a pandemic of this scale probably has been a century back. People are talking about the Spanish flu in 1920. So none of us in this panel were really aware of how to deal with such kind of pandemic and such kind of disruption. This was unprecedented, a black swan kind of an event, if you want to call it in the supply chain parlance. And it disrupted both your upstream and downstream. We've had recessions, through the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, where primarily your demand has been disrupted. But this was one event where both your supply and demand, both upstream and downstream, were equally disrupted. At the start of the pandemic, everything came to a standstill with China, being impacted very heavily, going into a lockdown mode. And then once the pandemic spread across the world, the entire world came to a standstill. China being the factory of the world, even in terms of, pharma, we all know all the chemicals, a lot of chemicals, key starting materials, a lot of active ingredients are supplied from China. So that initial shock was, unprecedented. Everything came to a standstill. And then that's how I look at it, this situation, in three phases. One was the complete shock where both my demand and supply came to a standstill. Number two was when my supply started to recover, where China started to open up. And, my supply end of the value chain started to recover. But still the demand was nowhere where it was. Even in the pharma industry, we heard Pavel talking about pantry buying and the bigger SKUs being sold through. But in pharma, it was something different. We saw a slump in demand. Though a lot of people will not understand this, but a lot of elective surgeries, a lot of people stopped going to the doctors literally. And a lot of medications, we saw through a lot of, generic drugs, which are being taken across the population in the world, we saw a slump in demand. A few drugs, I mean, HCQS being number one, and IPCA was in the midst of all this. We are one of the world's largest hydrochloric manufacturers and producers. So we saw HCQS demand go through the roof and other generic drugs fall through. So that was unprecedented. And the phase 3, which probably we have not yet entered, is the recovery. I mean, how that's what probably at the end of the session we'll talk about, ball gazing as to what we see the recovery to be through. Coming to your specific question, Vivek, as to one big change that I have seen in the pharma industry in supply chain, one is, of course, what Pavel just mentioned. People have started looking at supply chain from a different perspective. Earlier supply chain guys used to be the warehousing, the logistics people who get goods from A to B. Now people have started looking at supply chain guys as the guys who plan, who procure, who do the inventory management, who are actually the information cockpit for your value chain, for your specific industry. They are looking at demand sensing, they're looking at your supply capabilities, you're looking at what raw material inventories you should have, what finished good inventories you should have. So, it's good. I mean, it's good in a sense for us, supply chain executives that, people have started looking at us, like Pavel said, just a cost center or just as logistics and warehouse guys, and look at all these functions that, supply chain executives handle. One key change that I've seen in pharma particularly, and we have been laggers, I say that with no inhibitions, digitization. I mean, the digital transformation, the digitization effort around it, I mean, if somebody would have told me work from home for pharma executives, for R&D or research and development executives about 6-8 months back prior to the pandemic, people would have said, no, it cannot happen because pharma is, we need to protect our IP. It's in a very close bubble. We cannot expose ourselves. Work from home, remote working is all for, automobile and FMCG. But that one big change I'm seeing, that's the need of the hour. We have built safety nets around how we give access to certain people around certain applications. But that is one big change, if I have to say. The digital initiative that has gone through, giving people access to different records, letting them work remotely is one change that the pharma industry was not probably open for prior to the pandemic. It was going to happen eventually, I believe, because digitization is something that we cannot escape from, and supply chain digitization, pharma digitization is here to stay. But the pandemic has really pushed forward, given it a strong impetus and moved it very quickly forward. Yeah.
That's actually true for several industries, and it's heartening to see that even in the pharma side. But it's very interesting that while everybody anticipated that because of COVID, the pharma would probably shoot through the roof in terms of growth, but I think it's going to take time. The impact it's higher on this because of delayed surgeries and delayed other things that you mentioned about, and that's good insight because I know of a lot of sales teams who decided during pandemic that they should target the pharma industry because they will grow in the future. But it's a long haul. It's not going to happen in the short run. Right? Thank you. That's really helpful. Let me move to Harshal Bhoi now. Now on Xpressbees, being the experts in the last mile delivery and everything that happened across the country, everybody was relying on that skill set, that network. What was that again? One thing in your business, I'm sure you stretched your supply chain. I'm sure there are several things you had to do to make sure that the COVID-19 impact is taken into your stride. What was that one thing that you saw was the biggest change or impact because of COVID-19?
Well, good morning, everybody. I will not take the points again, which Mr. Srivastava and Mr. Mehta is taking. We all know the world has witnessed times which we have never seen before. One thing in the last few months which we have seen is, digital. We know all were in-house. People had to buy groceries, medicines, whatever. Customers who weren't digital savvy or who should never buy online or be in apps, they have been trending. The ratio of online buy has gone up. We all have done that. We all have done that. we have seen a significant, I will not say significant, it's a very small word for that. We have seen a significant growth more than in 10x, or in, I can't say numbers, where we have seen people going online and buying stuff. So at these times when the last mile has to be supplied through supply chain companies, and where the entire world was on a lockdown, or the entire country was on lockdown. At the start, it was difficult times. How do we have a control on the supply chain? But at this point of times, as rightly said by Mr. Srivastava, where the pharma sector had the sales people doing work from home concepts, unfortunately, the last mile guys, we cannot have a work from home concept. So they had to be on the field. Say, after being safety measures, these guys have to be on field. But the people, the down workforce, the entire workforce, half of the workforce were back to their hometowns, etc. We all know that. How do we still, take a charge of the supply chain? How do we still cater to the customers? That was a big point. Here, variable concept, when we have heard of the kiranas and the store models, etc. But here, since lot of salary cuts were happening, people wanted a source of income. People opted for variable sources. They were people joining, from societies to go out and deliver within their own societies. There were a group of people just doing deliveries in their own societies, and it was catered by a vans through having safety measures. Unlike the entire, the all other industries, the supply chain, with all experts here, we all are aware, the distribution, be the transport, be the last mile, be the first mile, had to happen. Otherwise, goods would not reach the end consumer. Here, what I see, since digital has gone up, one thing in the entire industry in last 8 months, or since Feb, is the variable. Everybody is coming from a fixed to a variable model. So in operations or in supply chain, where everything, there was more of a fixed model, a fixed inventory in out, people are opting, or companies are opting for a variable model. This is one change which I've seen. Number two, since it's purely on variable, the cost implication, there is a huge hit on the efficiency of the first mile supply chain, the mid mile and the last mile. Taking safety measures into hand. The delivery boy has to go to a gate, wait for the person to come in. He was not allowed to go out. So the efficiency of boys have dropped down. The cost has gone up. But again, because of the variable component, because of the cost on a per piece going to a variable, companies, the supply chain companies, have somewhere tried to leverage that and ensure that, in the long run, the small, if you see today, from the smallest to the biggest brands, all are online. And right from maybe 10 shipments to a day, or to maybe 100 or 1,000 shipments a day, all are online. How do you cater? That was the next question. Variable is one thing, putting all that cost, be it the first mile cost, last mile cost, and middle mile cost. Supply chain companies have a new thought of making everything variable. We never thought of making our mid mile variable, but now, yes, we have made a mid mile variable. We had never thought of doing the first mile variable. We had made first mile variable. So I would say, obviously, variable is one thing which has come in supply chain. It's, if everything has to be variable, it can't be on fixed cost going ahead. It is thought a lot of to be on variable cost.
That's very interesting, and I think it remains to be seen whether it will be a short-term measure or things that will continue in the long run or not, if when the economy really shoots back. So I think very, very interesting. Let me move to Dr. Anil now, because coming from Landmark Group, heavily on retail, malls were shut, high street took a while to get back. How were the supply chains coping up in 2020 due to COVID-19? What is that one thing that you did which was the most landmark change for you, for the Landmark Group, because of COVID-19?
Thanks, Vivek. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for the READ organization as well. Yeah, I guess this whole thing kind of, hit us like a tsunami, right? I mean, I remember very, very vividly, like, after our family holidays, we came through actually Hong Kong and Singapore and all that from US. In fact, in the month of let's say late January or whatever, already there were some rumors about there is some COVID, actually some coronavirus is there in China and so on. So our supplies for the Chinese New Year, period might get affected and all those things actually. But then come February mid, we were in a serious discussion in a huddle actually within the organization saying that, hey, this can really come and hit us really badly. And guess what? Before even you knew, the Janta curfew happened and 22nd or 23rd, we were asked to shut down all of a sudden. So everything came to a standstill, like, like almost like an emergency brake on a train or something like that. And we all know supply chain is actually a train, particularly retail, right from the concept, consumer, or actually from the, from the, the farm actually to the shelves or whatever, right? So it was a real, sudden shock. In fact, on one hand, we had to actually tell people not to come and open up because the malls were not open, as you rightly said. The shops had to be shut. People couldn't move around and all that. Now, there was a different kind of a set of rules for apparel, general merchandise, furniture, all of those things. There was also separate rules for actually the grocery side of it, right? Because we also have the spa supermarkets and so on. They become a part of the essential commodity and so on. Now, through this, in fact, we took almost like the entire month of April to kind of comprehend the situation itself. What the hell is happening here? I mean, how can you, lock the community, entire world community like this? And then we slowly started realizing that actually throughout the April, towards the end of April and early part of May, we realized, particularly on the apparel sector, people started feeling the need. I mean, let us understand, max customers are young women, college going girls, college going boys and all of them. And we had forgotten the golden, the triad or whatever that, the community or the, the civilization actually always wanted. Roti, kapda or makan. While we focus on roti and makan, because you could not leave the makan, kapda became actually a big thing for a lot of people. So our biggest challenge was, how do you connect with the consumers? Because there was a lot of consumerism happening. People were trying to reach out to the retailers. So we started actually calling them, getting through the WhatsApp group, getting through the digital channels, getting through the online channels and all that. Fortunately, Landmark Group was already very, very big, in a big way. We were present actually on online and omni-channel. Therefore, we already had our entire loyal base of customers of, millions of customers who are already there connected with us. When we started talking to them, we realized a huge actually demand in the, potential for the business actually there. So you won't believe, we started opening actually the channels, bits and pieces in the early May, and towards second half of May, we had so much demand, pent up demand actually for particularly casual wear, particularly essentials, and then kids garments, because kids wouldn't stop because of COVID, right? Kids keep growing. So the lady of the house actually needs to buy kids garments actually every second month, third month actually. So it became one side opportunity. So we started realizing that there is a huge demand by the consumer that she wants to buy clothes for not only kids, for herself. How many days you want her to see, or you want actually her to be wearing the same casual. I mean, after all, we had a couple of joggers, few t-shirts and all that. So there was a huge demand for all this casual and essential or the lounge wear, what we call it as. And once the demand started coming, at the end of, I remember, May, we had huge demand, but very few ways of servicing them, which probably we can cover it a little later, I guess. But then the consumer connect, and then understanding the consumer demand, even in the thick of the COVID, was a big learning for us as a retailer, particularly on the apparel, footwear, accessories, and all those things actually. Because let's say the casual wear or the lounge wear had only kind of, been a part of this, community for maybe 5-10% or whatever. But then COVID really pushed it up to beyond 50%. People wanted to buy lots of casual, the lounge wear, and then the leggings, and then, t-shirts and so on. So this understanding consumer sentiment and then understanding the need for kapda as an essential commodity, which governments and the authorities may not realize, by the way, but then this became such a huge learning for us. That was the biggest learning for me.
Yeah, sorry, even I didn't realize till the time you mentioned Roti Kapda Makan that it can almost qualify as that essential, and everybody is at home for weeks and months. And yes, I don't think people had enough casual wear at home to do justice to what they were doing at home. So I think, yeah, that's good, interesting insight. So let me move to Mr. Ajith Gopinath now. What did you see in the chocolate space, in the FMCG space? What challenges that one thing that you saw which was really path breaking in your business?
Thanks, Vivek, and good morning to all the panelists and all the attendees. Very glad to be on this panel. I mean, for us, I mean, the observations were quite similar. Prior to COVID, how things progressed once COVID hit, and once we kind of stabilized into the new situation, it was very similar to what Pavel mentioned. Being in the same industry, it's no surprise that what we have experienced is quite similar. So I won't touch on that. I think the one thing that I saw, and again, it's building on what Pavel mentioned. It's about how supply chain came into the spotlight, in our companies, and we were always an integral part of the business, but I think integration between supply chain and business increased many folds as we got into COVID. From a planning perspective, we moved from monthly to a weekly, or in some companies even daily planning cycles. That means, and that planning, which was essentially was a lot more supply chain driven, became kind of equally supply chain and business driven. So, and there was a lot more of information exchange, lot more of sharing, full disclosures. So I think the way supply chain and business integrated during this whole COVID event has been one of the striking points. The other one was how many of the conversations that we have been having as supply chain practitioners internally, and we have been trying to get the attention of the business for quite some time. How some of those topics and how some of those discussions kind of got fast forwarded or accelerated. How some of them have been brought to the present. Many of these conversations, many of these topics have been like part of the long-term pipeline or the planning pipeline to be done over a period of 3 to 5 years. But then with COVID, many of these topics have now become an essential. I'll cite the example of e-commerce, how the demand has shifted from offline to online, and how there was, I mean, it was always a trend, right? I mean, offline e-commerce was always growing as a percentage of the total business, but then with COVID, it saw a sudden surge, and now the baseline has already shifted. So topics like automation, supply chain automation, logistics automation, or cognitive planning, which were in the pipeline for the long term, which were in the 3 to 5 years plan, have now come to this, now has kind of been accelerated. The other one is, SKU rationalization. I mean, it's been a trend across companies, and we as supply chain practitioners have always been talking about the inefficiencies of the tail SKUs, right? The inefficiencies in planning, on the shop floor, in logistics, and in handling. But somehow, in some cases, of course, in pockets that has happened, but not entirely. But with COVID, I think that came up as a big driver of supply chain efficiencies. Because you needed to have lower number of SKUs on the shelf to get more attention from the consumer. Even the consumer, as a trend, the consumer wants to get in and out of the store at the earliest and does not want a huge number of SKUs to choose from. And the fact that these SKU rationalization, for example, what we have driven, or probably what companies have driven over this period, it might probably be here to stay. I mean, companies like Coca-Cola have already talked about the fact that some of the rationalizations that they've done might be here to stay. So these are, I think it's overall how supply chain has become better integrated with business, how some of those conversations have now become not just supply chain discussions, but enterprise-wide discussions.
Yeah, I think that's very nicely put, because supply chain always had a seat on the strategy table, but I guess because of COVID, it got more mind space and more time in the discussions, because then everybody realized the critical nature of what was being done. I think that's really helpful to understand. Let me just now go to Mr. Vikram Mansukhani. I think you are surrounded right now by your end user potential clients. You're a service provider here. On the panel, you're the only service provider. You would have a diverse view from multiple sectors, how they did, how they reacted, and what they did. So from your business perspective, what did you see? What was that one major change as a 3PL firm that you noticed from firms like, or the businesses or the industry which are on the panel and otherwise as well? What was that one major change that you noticed?
Yeah, hi Vivek, and big hello to all the panelists and also to all the folks attending. It's quite amazing to see almost 200 people on the audience. So I think everyone shared sentiments in almost like a tsunami kind of hitting us, etc. I think 2 or 3 things, and I'll finally come to what the outcome has been. One, surely there was a sentiment of emotion, in the first, say, 30 to 45 days in terms of, oh, it's, quite bad as to what's happened. And, everyone kind of empathizing with the service partners, etc. And very, very quickly, I think when people realized that there were alternate means of getting product to market, that emotion or empathy changed to expectation, right? I think people just wanted to get the product out, irrespective of what the situation on the ground was. The tolerance levels of things not happening on time, not happening in full, not happening accurately, kind of went down the chute. And why I bring this up really is at the center of all of this. I think what's really taken precedence is the valuation of human capital. Very, very often, and I think one of the panelists mentioned, no one really bothered how things were moving to market, right? But when there was a lack of availability of human capital, both in terms of quantity and quality, you suddenly realize that the picker on the shop floor was the most important guy, right? You couldn't bother in the month of March or February, whether, he was dressed properly, whether he came on the back of a bus. And in May, you were willing to send out a Mercedes to pick him up from his house because you wanted to make sure that he came to work and the product left the warehouse, right? You were willing to put him up in the Taj because you wanted him to work a double shift, right? And I think everything that's happened around digitization, automation, process engineering, etc., is fundamentally because the understanding or the realization of human capital and how important it is on the shop floor has gone up many, many fold. And I can, say this very proudly that at least for an organization like us, the way we have evolved in the last 6 to 9 months on, training people, on equipping people to do their job a lot better, whether it is through digitization, automation, or, training at the shop floor, that has had to go through a absolute sea change. And I think that's something we're going to continue to see. There was realization, I think, for many years now, not much has, led to fruition of the way we've changed benefits, etc., to them. But there was realization that the trucker community is, fast disappearing and we need to do something. I think now this pandemic has really taught us that even in the warehouses, the skill set that some of these folks bring to the table and their importance is not something that we can take for granted. And there's a lot more that needs to be done.
I think that's nice way to summarize the entire conversation. While the entire world was struggling with challenges, it did bring out the best in a lot of other businesses. A lot of opportunities came out. A lot of things which are on the back burner got done quickly, and it did allow us to focus on the positive, and that's allowed all these changes that we just discussed. And I think that's the underlying theme that I see. Yes, there were problems. Yes, there were challenges. But everybody, after the initial shock, looked at the positive, the expectations, as Mr. Mansukhani just said, and then focused on the positive. And a lot of things got done which are very positive. I'll now I'll go back to the lead team before I go into the meat of the conversation today when we go into each topic separately. If you could post the result of the first question, let's just quickly see what the result of the first question was. Interestingly, since we asked the first question, the number of participants have doubled. So I will request them to put this again. So it was very clear. About 5 to 10% is the range, which 54% of the people said that the supply chain costs have gone up by about 5 to 10%. So that's very interesting. Now, if you could close this, and I would request the read team to run the second question now, because when it came up the last time and people would have given their answers, we only had about 100 people. Now there are more than twice, 2.5 times that people now. So let me just go through the second question now, which is, and I think that links to the questions we had in the opening session. This wasn't planned like this, but it's very pertinent. How much has your organization's supply chain recovered from the COVID impact? Is it fully recovered? Is it partially recovered? Or has it started recovering only now? As in pharma, we just discussed in this panel, it's only started recovering now. So I would request our participants to quickly click on this. The host and the panelists cannot vote. It's only for the people who are participating. I think this is very valuable insight for all of us. Good background information and examples being shared. So while people are polling, I think we'll have a few seconds. And if there are enough, let's say if there are 100 plus responses, if I would request Reed to now post the answer for this question as well. Okay, so partially recovered, overwhelming. So I can see about 120 people have voted, and 63% people are saying we are still not out of the woods. It's still partial recovery, and about 12% of them are saying started recovering only now. I'll be very interested to know who these 25% people are who are fully recovered. I want to figure out who's so confident. It's a very heartening thing to see. But yeah, things are heading in the right direction. Let's jump straight into the core of our conversation. Here, I will ask very specific questions to our panelists, specifically to their industry, their business, and I'll start with Dr. Anil. And the question for you, sir, is the Landmark Group's retail brand portfolio is very diverse. Post-lockdown, the question for you is post-lockdown, A, which region picked up the fastest or had the least supply chain barriers or issues? B, which retail format has shown the most resilience? Department stores, value formats. You've already touched upon it briefly. And C, by how much have you seen the B2C deliveries pick up in your business? So you're on mute.
It's an absolute pertinent question, Vivek. In fact, it's been a big learning also for us. In terms of which region did it pick up, obviously the South became probably a lot more quick to respond because of also the concessions that actually the South, in fact, the governments were giving. So very, very quickly, we started actually picking up. I mean, Bangalore was probably one of the first ones to kind of, start recovery. Karnataka and Bangalore, they started recovering quite quickly. And also because most of our loyal customers who were brick and mortar customers, they switched on to the online as well as an omni, which means if the stores were open, they were actually ready to get a delivery from store itself. I mean, we switched the entire format from they having to come to store. We started doing that. We also started doing appointments actually as well. So customer can come at a certain time, quickly go to the whatever aisles they wanted. Within 20 minutes, they can get out. We also use the payments, payment set of things. So the major cities, let's say Bangalore, Chennai, Hyderabad were the quick ones to probably get it. But then Chennai again got closed. So it was primarily Karnataka and AP and Telangana, which is Hyderabad mainly, which kind of showed the fastest recovery. That was a quick answer on that. Now, as far as the which format really got back into that, I mean, you wouldn't believe we were even getting inquiries for furniture during COVID. I mean, can you believe? Because people started realizing that they are missing certain actually furniture sets at home. And then I also heard from my friends in white goods manufacturing that people are trying to buy a better washing machine because husbands have to wash the clothes now at home, right? And then they wanted a larger fridge now. So these were some of the interesting learnings. But then the business really picked up on the value fashion big time because people wanted value for money. They didn't want to overspend it. They were very cautious. They didn't know how long the COVID is going to actually sustain or how long it's going to exist in fact. So therefore, they wanted to actually get a value for money. Obviously, out of our lifestyle, Max, and then Splash, and then Easy Buy, our Max was probably the single largest one which picked up. And interestingly enough, Easy Buy, which is our super value format, that really overtook Max in terms of, the traction. And mind you, the largest demand came from, not from metro cities, from all the tier 3, tier 4 cities, or tier 2, tier 3 cities, in fact. There was so much of actually business coming from places like Hubli, Mangalore, the Davangeres and of the world actually. So it was very evident that tier 2, tier 3, the demand was going almost like, 5 times, 6 times and so on. In terms of the overall demand, our online saw a huge shift, like one of our other panelists mentioned. In the month of May, at the end of May, I was sitting with almost like 5 to 6 times the volume of orders to be servicing through the online channel. I mean, that was a kind of actually huge volume that went through. And also when we also went up with the marketplaces such as Myntra, Flipkart and Amazons of the world, we saw almost like, as much as 8 to 10 times on those peak days actually, which was unbelievable. I mean, because customers know about the Max brand, they know the value proposition, all of that is there. But they just didn't want to come to the stores. They wanted to order it online and then kind of get that. That really put a huge pressure on the back end, which is supply chain, because whatever our tags were there, let's say you were doing something like 10,000 pieces per day, I had to now do as much as 7 or 8 times that. I mean, how do you do that with all the issues around people and so on? So that became a challenge, but then those are the 3 quick answers actually for that. So it went up as much as actually 7 to 8 times.
Wow, I mean, and that is unbelievable. Because one would have expected an apparel or a group focusing on fashion and stuff to struggle. So I'm sure the focus shifted, but it's very good news to hear. And I just wanted to add to your observation on furniture. We, as Cushman Wakefield, do a lot of work on the workspace, office, real estate, and we know of several of our clients, several of the IT companies who've actually given financial assistance to their employees to secure a workstation in their home, because they were not ready to work from home.
Sure,
and so there are large IT firms who've done that, and possibly you saw demand from Hubli and others, because people who were from Hubli were working in Bangalore, moved back home, and then needed support there. So very interesting observations for all of us here. Let me then move to Mr. Pavel Mehta now. As a layman would believe, one would assume that Nestle's portfolio of brands situation would have returned to normal quite quickly, but I believe that was not really the case. The sales of some products went through the roof and others lagged. So what changes had to be made or are being made in the Nestle supply chain to manage this transformation in consumer demand?
You're absolutely right. So I think what Dr. Anil mentioned also, as a direct impact of the pandemic, we saw a couple of changes. In fact, we did a very interesting study in the initial phase of the pandemic, and we found that if you look at our portfolio, there was a strong pull towards buying more of a certain section of our portfolio. So, for example, you take our milk-based products, milk powders and fresh milk. So there was a very clear indication that people want to buy more of those products. There was also a very clear indication that people would continue to buy a majority of our portfolio in Nestle at more or less the same level. There was no reason for them to buy less Maggi, for example, which was very heartening, because Maggi is a huge business for us. Then there was a section of our portfolio which was, I would say, more or less unaffected by even a huge event like the pandemic. For example, our baby food business, by the very nature of the kind of products that we are making and being a market leader in this area, it is very less affected by even a huge event like the pandemic. Ajith might disagree with me, but we found that there was a very clear indication that people wanted to buy less chocolates, at least in the initial phase of the pandemic. And this we saw in our sales. And of course, chocolate having a very unique and different route to market, different warehousing, different logistic requirements, the complications in driving the chocolate business was strong. Now, one area where we found a big drop, of course, is not very well known, but we also have a very substantial out-of-home business in which we supply tailor-made products to hotels, to hostels, to small restaurants, etc. Now that obviously took a big beating and still continues to be a big challenge because out-of-home consumption has, as you know, has reduced dramatically, even though some hotels, restaurants are opening up, but it is still way behind of what it was in the pre-COVID environment. So overall, our portfolio went through a bit of I would say, a bit of an impact, but we are without any false humility, I would say that we are more or less back to our pre-COVID situation as far as the demand is concerned. Now, when it comes to supply chain, and this is where I think to your comment that I would really like to meet those 25% people who say that their supply chain has fully recovered. I think we have not. There's still a lot of work that we need to do to recover back to that level. What COVID has done, at least, and I'm finding this not just in Nestle, but in many companies, it has exacerbated, I would say, structural issues that were already there. I'll give you a simple example. If you have fundamental capacity issues, you can ride through in a situation where there are not big fluctuations in demand, right? Because you can manage inventory, you can plan. But in an environment where there is such big volatility in demand, which is what we are now seeing post-COVID, if you have fundamental structural capacity issues, those will result in a dramatic loss in your in the fill rates that you're able to provide to your customers. So those are the kind of issues because of the pandemic, which are now becoming front and center for Nestle, for us here, and I think for a lot of organizations, the industries. So what we'll probably need, what we will do and we are doing now in the next few months and maybe even years, is to be very prudent in the way we are looking at the whole investment scenario. I'll give you, and I really liked what Harshal said in his initial address, is that moving away from a fixed model to a more variable model. The traditional way of saving in supply chain has been, at least in our industry, has been through scale. That's the way, FMCG industry wants to save money. You scale, you build a huge factory, you build a huge warehouse, you have 3-5 year contracts in all areas. Now, that is going to shift. What we will shift is from saving through scale, I think, and we are already seeing that it will shift to saving through operational efficiencies. Because you cannot invest because I would say the volatility and your ability to predict the future has become less. So the way you will save will shift from saving through scale to saving through operational efficiency. And there, efficiency in warehousing operations become absolutely important, right? You need to invest because you need to automate. That is the future, but you need to be very careful. And this is where, options like scalable, warehousing operations. I want to invest in a certain X amount. My demand for the next 2 years is 2X, but I don't want to invest in 2X today. But I want to have the option of scaling it up by 20% every quarter. So these are the kind of things which I think overall between manufacturers and between service providers we will see in the next few years, because the game it has shifted and will dramatically shift over the next few years from the way we look at saving in the past, from the way we will look at saving in the future.
I would have loved to have a real estate developer, warehousing developer listen to you today. Thankfully, Mr. Mansukhani is here, so at least there is inputs coming into the 3PL side. But yeah, I completely hear you. Just to go back, yes, I think everybody here on the panel as well felt the drive for people to just consume Maggi before lockdown or during lockdown, or the carton milk that you provide, and that completely changed the equation. Interesting day. So, but the one thing that struck me in your conversation was you said that while you've reached the demand to pre-COVID levels, but the supply chain is still, still needs a lot of working to do. So that's like a very interesting thing, that demand has gone up, but supply chain is still recovering.
And that's a very, in my view, that's what I say. I think it's a great time to be a supply chain professional, because at the end of the day, this is a good problem to have as a business. You have good demand, you need to figure out how to supply it. So that's the thing.
Great. So let me then now move to Mr. Ajith Gopinath. And my question to you, sir, is that the industrial supplies took time to normalize for everyone post the lockdown and unlock. We've had that conversation today as well. With India ranked 16 in the global cocoa production, what were the unique supply chain challenges that you have faced so far? Was everything sourced locally? How was your supply chain managed because of the changed consumer preference?
Yeah, so I mean, we have a lot of imports coming in, and that feeds into our supply chain, and we face the typical challenges, which is shipments getting stuck, customs clearances getting delayed, and as a result of which but of course everyone had disruptions, both on the client side as well as the supplier side or partner side. So essentially some of the initial kind of shocks got balanced out, but as we recovered, of course, as customers, as manufacturers, we had to increase safety stocks for some of the items. I think one of the unique challenges and that we faced, and as from a procurement standpoint, was the sourcing. As we got into the as we got into the pandemic, as the pandemic took grip, and supply chains and logistics networks tightened, and there was the supplies of there were market shortages for PPEs, and I think one of the markets which probably bounced back quite early and was China itself, and there was a lot of production capacity, but coming out of China, there were no flights. Logistics majors like DHL, FedEx, they were struggling to get going, and literally we had to bank on our strategic partners, our strategic supply partners, to kind of get a solution. So we had to find suppliers who could manage their own logistics. In fact, I mean, there were instances where PPE and face masks were kind of flying out on chartered flights from China to other markets. And then following that, the other challenge was how to, where to land these shipments, because, after COVID, there were, countries closed down, there were border restrictions. So, we had to find the right location where these stocks could enter and also exit for redistribution. So, but at the end of the day, so it was again many teams within the organization coming together, procurement, logistics, import-export teams, legal, corporate affairs, to kind of create a parallel supply chain for PPEs. That was one of the unique experiences, and which actually was a big driver in kind of ensuring that there were no manufacturing disruptions because of the safety requirements, because of social distancing, and to prevent infection. So I think that was one of the points where the recovery started. But one of the takeaways from the whole episode was the way the importance of having strategic partnerships on the supply front. I think most companies would have experienced this. Wherever we have, at least from my personal experience, I can tell you, where we had major strategic engagements, it was really kind of very convenient and easy to set up governance, daily, weekly, to monitor shipments, monitor connectivities, information being exchanged. I mean, it was very commonplace to see a top executive from a customer side picking up the phone and talking to a top executive from the partner side to get more information, to get inputs, to seek suggestions, and many a time, because every location, every country had a different, there were the lockdowns, there were unlocks, but it was varying by different geographies. In many cases, it was the suppliers who were kind of, giving us information, and they were actually it actually helped us get the readiness in place to face some of these shocks, or to kind of build up stocks, or to take preventive and precautionary measures. So I think from my experience, the importance of having these strategic partnerships, I think it really came to the fore in this whole episode.
understand what you're saying. I think almost everyone became more hands-on. And whichever level you were in, I mean, supply chain was something that everybody took for granted. But when the blood stopped flowing in the veins, everybody became hands-on. And this was like a situation where, as you mentioned, the top people were talking to the top people and trying to figure out how to make sure things got done. And we saw that across the board, across every industry, every business. So yeah, that I completely agree with you. Now, we are right in the middle of our stage 2 of the discussion. If I could now ask Reed to share our third question for the participants to take their opinion on the questions that the panelists have actually suggested for the audiences. So this question is, and we've discussed automation during our conversation already, automation in supply chain due to COVID, right? Are such changes genuine or just noise? I mean, so what is just noise that these changes will probably happen in the short run and people will forget about them in 21, 22? Or are they measures for the short term that yes, people will use it now because there's a need for doing it now, but not in the long run? But such changes like automation and other changes in supply chain due to COVID are long-term change. So if you could answer these three, and a moment the response crosses 100, if I could request Reed to share the result of the poll on the screen before we move on to the next one. Okay, 75% people are saying these are long-term changes. These are not, so the digitization thing that we're talking about, the automation, everything else that we're talking about, at least the specialized participant group of this webinar, who are supply chain professionals in some shape or form, think that these are long-term changes, and we've had almost 100 responses. So that's a very good, heartening thing to see again. Now let me move to, let me continue with the core discussion. Let me move to Mr. Vickram Srivastava. Coming from the pharma side, and we discussed this before the panel started, there were very unique hiccups and challenges that the pharma industry faced, and you touched upon it in your opening remark as well. So what was those challenges? I mean, many people thought that pharma would be doing brilliantly well, and that's the industry to focus on. But what were the challenges that you saw, and how did those were overcome, specific to the pharma industry side?
Thanks, Vivek, for that question. So, let me, break it down. I mean, I primarily see the challenges in pharma in two buckets, upstream and downstream, of course. So if I have to look at upstream, there are two major nodes, I mean, two major functions in supply chain or the value chain that severely got impacted. Was number one was procurement, how we are sourcing our goods. Like I told you, in the pharma industry, a lot of, ingredients, key starting material, actives are imported. Primarily, I mean, the major import is from China, but we import, the Indian pharma industry imports literally from across the world, starting from US, Europe, Far East, like I mentioned. So that was one big hit. So on the upstream, procurement and production, like I said, at the start of the pandemic, when everything came to a standstill, government stopped everything, and the pharma industry, manufacturing also got impacted. Though the government was very quick to classify pharma as an essential service provider, and we started to revamp and restart our manufacturing. But having said that, pharma manufacturing cannot work in isolation. All the nodes that support, for example, the local printers, the carton printers, the foil printers, they have to be aligned. I mean, it cannot work in isolation that only the pharma manufacturing facility is working. So those were the challenges initially that we saw. On downstream, if I have to look at, two major buckets again was demand sensing. I mean, like I mentioned, it comes as a surprise to a lot of people, but we did see our demand go down. It is recovered to probably pre-COVID levels, but we are nowhere close to the growth numbers that we were projecting, because it's difficult to go out for the sales and marketing guys to meet the doctors. The doctors are not ready to meet. How do you increase the footfall? How do you increase the visibility of generic drugs, So that's been a challenge for the pharma industry also, getting into the growth numbers. I mean, the demand has more or less, recovered, I would say again. even for pharma. But the growth numbers are still, we've not seen. And of course, the main node that connects all of this was distribution, logistics and distribution. We all know when the pandemic started, even, the flights coming in was a huge challenge. We heard Ajit talk about which ports to, get the flights landed on. How do we get chartered flights? If you have to move a small shipment, say 1,000 tons, 1 ton or, 5 tons, how do we move that in a chartered flight? Where do we land it? Right from there to even moving the trucks from, say, Goa to Maharashtra, that became a challenge. For pharma companies specifically, if I have to talk about IPCA, we have manufacturing facilities spread across India, right in Dehradun, Sikkim, Maharashtra, Goa, everywhere. So if I have to move, say, a material from a vendor in Goa to Sikkim, how do we do that? I mean, crossing 6, 7, 8 states during the peak of pandemic. The truck drivers were not able to move the goods, because even if you give them all the authority letters, you give them all commissioner goes, how do the truck drivers go 5, 6 days across 7, 8 states, with all the dhabas closed, no place to stay, nothing to do. So that became a challenge. I mean, that was a real issue that even, I mean, I'm sure other members on this panel will also agree that they would have also faced similar kind of issues. But even in pharma, that was a challenge, looking at both upstream issues, like I mentioned, procurement and production, and downstream demand sensing and distribution and logistics. So those were the two, buckets at which I would look at how we, face the challenge during the pandemic.
Thanks. And I think you've covered, we didn't discuss the challenges so far, but what you were mentioned is, I think, probably was the fact of life during the lockdown, and pharma, in spite of being essential, faced that challenge, which is a big learning to make sure that these things don't happen again in the future. Let me now move to Harshal. And my question to you specifically is that, as Xpressbees, you have about 30,000 people who are feet on street in about 1,900 plus cities. You as a company shown 100% year-on-year growth since 2015. Now that's impressive in its own way, but I'm sure there was still significant jump and transformation in 2020 because of the move to online and digitization. How did your supply chain cope with that? You've talked about the variable bit, but what else did you do? What were the 3 biggest challenges that stretched your network to the brink?
Okay, let me start with thankfully, it was the last year when we started a variable model. So when COVID struck, we were somewhere about 20-30% of our entire network was on variable mode. But on a lighter note, in this, we had a lot of learnings during COVID times as a human, as an individual, as a company level, at all levels. So for example, all husbands would have a new art, either of sweeping, swapping, or dishwashing. So when things started moving out somewhere in the month of April, as Mr. Anil said, Mr. Dr. Anil said, there were a lot of garments and everything online purchases. At the same time, we saw a big steep jump in the boxes. When I say the box, I'm a logistics guy. So for me, it's a half a kilo shipment or a 5 kilo shipment. Suddenly, the gymming equipments was online. The health supplements were in demand. The dishwashers was in demand. Now, at that moment, when you are struggling with manpower across, migrant workers going back, there's nobody to deliver even a half a kilo shipment. How do you deliver these big parcels? Was a big question. So keeping automation, which is the first mile, sorters, etc. Last mile is purely human dependent. It cannot change. And I don't see drones, coming into India doing this at least for some next few years, So there had to be something out of the box to be thought about. So, I stay in a society with over 19 odd buildings and about 1,800 odd flats. When all started, I had a delivery boy, Xpressbees, coming to my gate, twice a day. I randomly checked with what he does, how much delivery he does a day. With that process and that thought, every society today, have a set of watchmen or gatekeepers across. How do I leverage? How do I, ensure that I utilize my manpower? What we have done is we have, put some small things into place. Like, in my society, a shift of a security guard is finishes at 8 o'clock in the morning. Whatever shipments comes to us, we have aligned with the security agency. We have known to people who come to a house for delivering whatever, so their background verification is done. We drop all the shipments there at that gate. These guys deliver and hand over at the evening the COD money or the run sheet, or they work on majorly on app. So here the cost has come down. That's number one. The manpower which was utilized in this place can be utilized somewhere else. So at this time we had to do some ideas. We had to bring some thought processes where we can utilize the current manpower in a more efficient way. So this was one of the examples. At the same time, we have challenges, as Mr. Vikram rightly said. In state borders, vehicles, there are passes. Every individual, with 30,000 fleet on street, I cannot have, everyone could not be grant passes. It was very, 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 very difficult. Meet up to local authorities, police, etc. It was very difficult. So there was a time where, even the state, when we used to cross the state, vehicles were interrupted, there were passes. So there were a lot of collaboration done within local players and to mid-segment players. This is one thing which I also saw in the last 6 months. So where unorganized players, where customers were going towards, they had a soft sweep towards unorganized players. Now I see those same customers moving towards more organized players. So that is the second thing I saw. There was a lot of collaboration between the small players and the large players in terms of handling their intercity or regional transports. That's the second part. The third and the most important part was the efficiency of the buoy. As the cost comes with efficiency for a logistics player, especially for a last mile player. And we saw a significant drop in efficiency. The reason I quoted earlier was, the staff were interrupted at regular intervals, where you're going, show your pass, etc. Second was they were waiting at the gates for people to come down. So those were some reasons. So, but at the same time, since the volume increased, there was a huge surge on the online. That density helped us to overcome those challenges. So where I may take this point as negative, at the same time, since the volume grew up, the delivery boy within a radius of maybe 4 kilometers who used to deliver about 40 packages a day, today is catering to 60 packages a day. So because of surge in online, the density of the areas have actually grown. There was a very steep buy also, which we noticed in the market in the tier 3 and tier 4 locations. But in the metros, they normally in metros, if you see, the switch is on online and offline. People try to go on weekends and buy pre-COVID times. But now the demand in metros also high. So three major reasons. One thing was we had faced in manpower. So we tried to variable. We tried the society watchman model. We have car washers. But those guys were idle. They were delivering in societies, etc. The second was we tried to collaborate with some local players, and we tried to shift the interstate and inter-regional movement. Third was obviously the efficiency of the buoy. We have to keep the cost in control. The migrant laborers were out. So, but thanks to the volume increase, the efficiency was somewhere controlled.
So I think the one line that came to my mind when I was listening to you is a phrase that necessity is the mother of invention. And
yeah,
definitely
absolutely
true for you, but I think it's probably true for everybody on the panel and in the supply chain business. But using guards, as delivery boys, or even the car washers, I think that's just those out of the box ideas that were needed to make sure that there's enough lubrication in the supply chain and things keep happening. I think that's brilliant. Now, let me go again, not planned, but let me go to the last question for the second part to Mr. Vikram Mansukhani. The question to you, sir, is cost savings seems to be the mantra right now. We discussed this as well, and it'll probably continue. It'll probably get executed even more in 2021. What changes have you witnessed in your clients' requirements in 2020? How has your offering evolved in this short period to meet their demands, and how have you coped with that new normal?
So I think one of the key reasons why outsourcing is done to a 3PL partner is either SLA improvement or cost savings. So I think we live and eat and breathe in that environment. And it's just been further accentuated during this time, especially given the fact that the whole B2B model has kind of come crashing down or has kind of diluted itself. And the B2C model is taking precedence in a very large way. I think the only way to really do it is to ensure that your human capital is invested in fully, because it's surely calling for a different skill set. It's not the same skill set either in terms of man, machine, or process, which delivered, say, 10 refrigerators or 10 television sets to one dealer. You now need to go and do it to 10 individuals' houses. And the individual doesn't want to, just see a guy in not so pleasant work clothes. He wants to see a person who's smelling of roses. He wants to see a person who's smiling. He wants to see a person who's, able to fill in a feedback form instantaneously. He wants to see a person who can install the machine for him at the time of delivery, right? So I think the whole landscape has changed. And yes, while we are kind of removing the duplication from the process, because earlier you would do a delivery from a large warehouse into a small warehouse, then from a warehouse you would reload it and go on another vehicle. Now a lot of deliveries are happening straight out from the warehouse to the last point of consumption. So some of this is by design in terms of cost saving. Some of this is going to happen in terms of default. The pandemic is creating a default of its own, which is causing some cost savings. The moot point would be to capture how much is having by default and obviously let it happen. What is happening by design is something where the knowledge and the organizational capability comes in. And to that extent, what we're really seeing is a move away from smaller players who are more disorganized to more structured players. We're seeing more and more of our customers move in that manner. The quality and quantity of bids that we have received as an organization in the last 9 months, I think it's unprecedented. So it's creating another challenge in terms of the back office solutions teams. Their availability for us to turn bids around faster, and obviously implementation teams to go and execute all of this a lot faster. That's one challenge we're facing, and it'll probably lead to, I think, creation of maybe supply chain schools faster, supply chain centers of excellence much faster, which is surely at this point of time a area which has not been looked into to the extent that's really required. So I think from just being a service, it is surely becoming a science, and we will need more and more people from the industry to enable downstream execution or to enable schools of excellence in supply chain. And I think the need is really been augmented by the pandemic.
Yeah, and I completely buy that logic, because yes, there are some institutes who provide the specialized training, but the need for having experts and professionals and learning in this space is very clearly evident now, considering how fast the supply chain business is evolving because of COVID. So I think we now, thanks for your answer. Then we're now at the end of part 2. Most of our discussion is over now, so I would request if the READ team can put up the last question for the participants, and then we can go on to the conclusion, which is essentially crystal ball gazing. So coming to the last question, how is the choice of supply chain partners changing due to COVID? Are the firms going for smaller and local firms? Are they going for larger established Indian or international firms, or there is no change? Interestingly, we've discussed this today. It wasn't planned, but the points got discussed, and we had the question planned as well. So And if there is adequate response, I'll request the Read team to quickly share the result of the poll as well. Let me see if you have the response now. Okay, interesting. While there is a move, 30% people think that they're moving to smaller local firms, but there is this move towards size or quality. The larger established Indian and international firms, 57% people think that they will go in that direction, which is extremely very, very interesting. Now, we're moving on to the last bit of our conversation. We were thinking of doing some crystal ball gazing, and in the interest of time, because we only left about 10 odd minutes, and there are some questions that I would want to pose to the panelists. If in one sentence or just a few words, you could quickly give your answer on one measure and this is linked to our topic of discussion as well. What is that one measure that you would implement in your supply chain during 2021 to boost the bottom line? Now, this could be a one word answer. It could be one sentence. Let's just quickly go through it so that we jump straight into the questions from the participants. There are a lot of questions there. So if I could start with Mr. Vikram Mansukhani, because let's start with your inputs, then I'll go to the rest of them. Just one word answer, one sentence at max.
I think clearly the word is agility, which could mean nimbleness and adoption. The demands are growing manifold, and the demands are going at a pace that we've never seen before. To be able to adapt and deliver in very, very quick speed, I think that's really the key essence of what we see happening for the next 12 months.
Correct. Dr. Anil, your one word, one sentence answer to this.
Vivek, I've always been holding this point actually for the last almost 10 years now. Ever since I came back to India, actually, I always look at three things. One, delivery. Let's actually make sure that there is delivery of services happen. Number two, the quality of actually delivery happens. And the third thing, which is supply chain cost, will automatically be able to kind of generate, and then we can share the cost actually. So let's focus on, again, service, quality, and the cost, or actually the money will flow into all the partners actually if you are in a fair game.
Right, got it, understood. So now, Mr. Vickram Srivastava, what's that one thing for your bottom line that you would want to implement in 2021? You're on mute.
Yeah, thanks. I would want to, look at the 3 new C's that we, as a professional, as the way I'm looking at the 3 new C's. I mean, we've always talked about connect, collaborate, and communicate. But the 3 new C's in my mind, which supply chain professionals across the industry will have to look at, is connect, will be continuous, and it will be contained. Very important. The last C. So, in my mind, if we continuous, we've already talked about the continuous manufacturing industry 4.0. Connectivity, we have always talked about being digital, being connected to all your stakeholders, but contained is very important. How do you protect your supply chain? How do you work with your suppliers and their suppliers? How do you go downstream with your sales and marketing and to your customers? So how do you contain your supply chain is going to be very important. Yeah.
Over to Mr. Ajith Gopinath. What's that one thing for your supply chain?
Yeah, but I think, and we've discussed this, some time back, was how we have leveraged scale so far to get cost savings. But I think the next level, and so we have kind of already plucked all the low-hanging fruits. So the next level is going to come from data. I think data science and data analytics will probably need to be an integral part of supply chain from here on.
I completely agree. Your inputs, Mr. Pavel Mehta, in terms of what is that one thing that you think will implement in 2021?
Yeah, I think very, very much in line with what the panel has said. Operational efficiency coming through, increased digitization, wherever possible automation. But just one rider, I don't think savings is going to save the day next year or even the year after. I think the name of the game next year and the year after will be, how do we continue to drive demand without losing focus on the savings? And in that context, I think what I would be very careful next year is all kind of discretionary spendings, because I do have to save, but I cannot save at the cost of rejecting demand next year. This will be the equation that I will be very careful with in the next couple of years.
I think everybody will agree on that. I think it's a very, very strong point. So final input from Mr. Harshal Bhoi. What is that one thing that you will implement in your supply chain for 2020?
I completely agree with Mr. Vikram. Agility and being flexible. In these times, it's being taught. We earlier used to plan. We used to do drawings. We had notice boards. A lot of planning used to happen. Now we have to be more fast, more efficient, more flexible for changes. This is what is taught to us. So next year, it is going to be these are my thoughts for it.
Sure. Okay. I think that completes our conversation. I have a set of questions from the participants, and let me start off. There are some generic questions, and there are some question or one question that has been asked specifically to one of the panelists, and that question is to Mr. Pavel Mehta. I'll just read it out for you. You mentioned that you had to make structural changes in your supply chain. Can you please elaborate on what type of structural changes did you have to make? That's the question from one of the participants.
Yeah. So we have done a few structural changes in the supply chain over the last couple of years. And the interesting thing is that many of those structural changes that we have done have happened in the thick of the pandemic. So, for example, we were very convinced that our entire order to cash organization needs to be more efficient, needs to be more standardized. We started that at the end of last year, continued that throughout the pandemic, and now we've reached a point where we have a very, I would say, a best-in-class order to cash organization. So that's one of the structural changes we did. The other was also on transport planning. It was very decentralized, very local. We took a decision towards the end of last year that we need to invest into having a more automated, digitized, tool-based, standardized transport planning operation. We continue to do that. And in fact, now we're going live with a lot of those, I would say, structural changes that we have brought about. So that's what I mean is that the structural changes have to be done in the view of driving operational efficiency. You have to be convinced that these are the structural changes which need to be done to meet the demand of the future as far as operational efficiency concerned. And then you don't stop in the middle, because the pandemic has been a huge event at the end of the day. So if you're convinced about the need for driving, that's in our case, as we were in driving operational efficiency, we continued with them even during the very, very tough times of the pandemic.
My next question, thank you very much. My next question is to Dr. Anil, which has been asked by one of the participants. They wanted some more inputs on how Landmark integrated their offline stores onto the online delivery mode. How was that done really on ground?
Well, we actually used quite a few means to do that. For example, when there was no business in the stores, so we almost had to lay off 50% of our actually workforce. When I say layoff, we let them actually stay home and don't come to work, but then we still kept paying them. What we actually ended up doing was, we realized that there was a struggle actually to get the delivery partners, in fact, give us a full-fledged services. So we converted our store staff into the delivery team, members. So let's say there is actually a delivery which has to happen from Jayanagar area. So Jayanagar store became literally the mini warehouse which services actually the Jayanagar area in Bangalore. So that's exactly how we extended or expanded actually our delivery capabilities using the store. That was one thing. Secondly, we also integrated actually our online to offline. In that sense, we created what is called as store-to-door delivery mechanism, which means a customer can go and then order that from a store catalog. Let's say the customer actually approaches either through WhatsApp selling or one of the catalog selling or whatever they approach. In fact, the store will send actually a link. The link can be opened, then customer can choose actually whatever garments that she needs it, and then she can order that and pay for it, or even the payment can even be done at home also. The contactless payment actually was organized actually. And then store to door was also used. Similarly, WhatsApp selling was used in fact. So that way we literally expanded our online capabilities, using our store staff. That's how, we were able to manage the 4x, 5x actually, demand from the customer.
Thank you very much. Now, the final question in the interest of time, and it's a very generic question, probably from a young upcoming supply chain professional. Their question is, would be grateful if we can discuss new trends in the warehousing space and the skill sets required for the top managers in the supply chain and warehousing space. So if anybody could volunteer to answer that, this will be the last question for our conversation, because then we run out of time.
I think more than ever before, hygiene, which is the ecosystem hygiene, automation and digitization, and all of this finally leading to how you are managing and controlling the human capital. I think that's really becoming a pivotal point, how you are managing your teams, how you're investing in them, and how you're upskilling them.
All right. Thank you very much. Over to you, Rima. I think we are done with the discussion. It was a brilliant discussion, very, very insightful. I take away a lot of points. In fact, I was taking notes while everybody was speaking. It was very helpful. I'm sure the other participants agree as well. Over to you, Rima, for the closing remarks. My thanks again to the panelists.
Sure. Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Dahiya, and all our esteemed speakers. I'm sure today's takeaway will be very helpful for all of us, and we appreciate you being here. The questions that has not been taken up in the Q&A, we will be taking them offline, and we promise that we will get back to you as soon as possible on that. The recorded version will be soon available on our YouTube channel and our website. Also, I'm happy to share, the new dates of our 10th annual India Warehousing Show from 23rd to 25th of July, 2021. And we look forward to see you all there. Thank you once again for joining us today. Have a good day and stay safe.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Rima. Thank you, everybody else. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.